Hello and welcome to our webinar, Minimizing the Effect of Wind using the new AutoTest Wind Assistant from TEC or the Energy Conservatory. I'm Bill Graber and I'm going to be co-hosting this along with Colin Olson, our senior staff physicist. Next. So let me briefly introduce both of us and then I'm going to hand it off to Colin so that he can take you through this. Colin is our senior staff physicist. He's a PhD in physics from the University of Wisconsin. He's got over 25 years experience with TEC, and he's been involved with many aspects of our product offering, as well as our software development, and been very intimately involved with software for the past several years. He's a key researcher in building science. Many people involved in research in the industry are familiar with Colin. He's been involved with multiple committees, including ASHRAE 193, ASHRAE 162, 62.2, and he's also served on the ABAA Whole Building Testing Committee, or ABA. So a lot of years of experience with Colin. As I said, I'm Bill Graber. I'm the marketing guy and the new one here at TEC. I came to TEC about 1.5 years ago after 27 years at Emerson in pressure and flow measurement there. And I am a mechanical engineer from the University of Minnesota. Next. So let me have one more slide here to make sure that if you're watching this, you know who TEC or the Energy Conservatory is. We've been in business for about 40 years. Our founder, Gary Nelson, started the business with a mission, and that mission was to develop air measurement tools and processes, working with the industry experts to help everyone in the industry deliver better built environments. And that means more healthy, more comfortable, more energy efficient, and more durable. So many of you know us for what's on the left-hand side, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, which is air tightness measurements. These are the Minneapolis branded products like the Minneapolis blower door and Minneapolis duct blaster, and the gauges that are used with them like the DG700, DG1000, and now the new DG8. We're also involved with HVAC airflow. And this includes things like the TrueFlow, and we have a new digital TrueFlow out this month, as well as the exhaust fan flow meter. So that's really who we are and what we do, but let's jump into today's session now.
All right, thanks a lot, Bill.
You bet.
So we're going to start out by talking about some best practices for minimizing the effects of wind. Gary Nelson did a webinar in August on this topic, which is much more in-depth into some of the effects that wind has around a building. And then we're going to talk about the Wind Assistant itself, which is a new feature of AutoTest. Look through some of the data that we use to prove out the features of the Wind Assistant, and then talk about where to get more information. So first of all, a review of what a blower door test is. Typically, a blower door test is done at a pressure of 50 pascals. That's about 1 pound per square foot. It's a pretty large pressure. It's the reason we test at such a high pressure is that we want to minimize the impacts of variations due to the wind. But as you'll see, even 50 pascals isn't always enough. And importantly, what we want to do is we want to turn on a fan and adjust the flow rate until we get a change in the pressure in the building by 50 pascals. We call that inducing a 50 pascal pressure change. The reason we do that is that a building starts out with a pre-existing pressure due to the thermal effects, also called the stack effect in the building, and the winds impacting the building. So the most reliable measure of air tightness is to see how much flow it takes to change the building pressure by 50 pascals. We're showing a single point test here at 50, but the same principles apply to multi-point testing. Sometimes we test buildings pressurized, where the pressure inside the building is higher than outside, and other times depressurized or negative pressure. Here we're depicting a depressurization test, where the air is being blown out through the blower door and we're creating suction inside of the building. That means all the air is trying to rush back into the building to make up for the air that we're blowing out. Usually we're testing at 50 pascals. Often we will do a more detailed test called a multi-point test, where we're testing at 50 pascals as well as lower pressures. And we'll talk about the implications of that. Sometimes we're testing with a positive pressure. Sometimes we're testing with a negative pressure. So a positive pressure test, we'd be blowing air into the building. Negative pressure test, we're blowing air out of the building. If the wind is blowing or if there are temperature differences between inside and outside, then the place where you measure the pressure will affect the reading. So the big problem with wind is when it's not a steady wind. If you think about it, if we're trying to induce a 50 Pascal pressure on the building, if we had a completely steady wind, there really wouldn't be much difficulty, because what we could do is measure the pressure that exists before we turn on the blower door. And then we could simply turn up the fan until we change that pressure by 50 Pascals. If the wind were completely steady, we could get an accurate measurement of how much flow it takes to induce that 50 Pascal change. There are some biases that are caused by wind, which is small inaccuracies that would still exist with a steady wind, but not nearly as bad as the fluctuations you get from an unsteady wind.
You know, Colin, I think that's interesting what you just said, because when you first think about this, as a new guy to the industry, you think, oh, we want a calm day. And that's probably true, but it's true because the wind gusts and moves around in its velocity. Not that there is a velocity of wind, but that it's changing a lot.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
If the wind speed is changing or the wind direction is changing during the test, the baseline that you're subtracting will not be the correct baseline, and you won't be accurately measuring the CFM50 of the building. It's essentially an error in the induced house pressure. So let's look at a quick example. If you're testing at 50 Pascals of pressure, and what you actually have is an induced pressure of 48 or 52, that 2 Pascal error would result in a CFM50 error of about 3%.
Okay. So you're saying if and that 48 to 52 is, you're saying that's what it's actually varying due to the effect of wind pushing pressure differently. It's not constant. So you're trying to hold 50, but it's varying because the wind is moving or changing, I should say.
Yes, in reality, it's really very complex and kind of difficult to model, because
okay.
as the wind speed is changing, it's going to be affecting all sides of the building differently. Typically, on the windward side, you're going to be pressurizing that outer wall relative to if there were no wind. And on the leeward side, you'll be depressurizing relative to no wind. And then on the sides of the building and over the roof, it can be really something anywhere in between. Typically, houses get depressurized by higher wind speeds.
I see. And then the wind shifts its direction a little bit too on windy days. I mean, there's a more dominantly leeward side and windward side of a building on a windy day, but it does kind of swirl at times, right? And that adds to the complexity.
Yes. And this gets even worse when you're trying to go to the lower pressure points in a multi-point test. For example, at 20 Pascals, let's say you're off by 2 Pascals. Now that's going to be an error down in that range of about 7%. And one measure of tightness of a building known as ELA, or effective leakage area, that's down at 4 Pascals. So things can get pretty tough down at those low pressures.
Right.
So the conclusion from this is we want to look for a location to measure the outside pressure where there will be the least fluctuations possible. The steady pressures we can deal with, but it's the fluctuations that we can't really deal with. So the simplest thing to do is to try to place your outside reference on the leeward side. Not because that's not going to fluctuate at all, but just because the fluctuations there are smaller. If we have pressure hitting this windward side of the building, that really builds up a lot of pressure as a function of wind speed compared to the relatively smaller effect on the leeward side. So that's the most important thing we can do to minimize the effects of wind. In order to try to get at this, we started out by doing some measurements just with very long-term measurements of pressures on a building, and then simulating what if we were to conduct blower door tests on a day where the baseline was really varying in the way that we measured. The advantages of doing a study that way is we can simulate any kind of blower door test starting at any point in time in that data series. So that's why we did our initial testing this way. And one thing that we discovered from that is that one of the best things you can do in terms of sequencing of your tests is just to make longer measurements.
Yeah.
And here we're showing the effects of how much air is there on the windward side and on the leeward side for the different pressure targets. So when you're inducing 60 pascals, 48, 35, 23, or 10. And this is the error in the measured building pressure. And you can see it's pretty dramatic. The leeward side is much better, typically about 1/3 of the amount of error due to the wind effect.
So it really, the data we took last summer, I think this was Gary and Steve Rogers, and maybe some data you took as well, but it kind of confirmed, yeah, the theory showed up in our long-term data too. I mean, the actual number might not be exactly 1/3, but it's quieter on the leeward side.
Definitely.
Okay.
So just an overall summary of best practices that Gary talked about in his webinar. If wind speeds are less than 5 miles an hour, you basically just have to get the outside pressure reference outdoors, but not near the fan. We don't want the air from the fan to be hitting the outside tap. And the time averaging period of 10 seconds is perfectly good. You get into 5 or 10 miles per hour range, it becomes worthwhile to run a tube to the leeward side. So if convenient, you could set up the blower door on the leeward side of the building. If not, you're going to have a longer tubing run to get you around to the leeward side of the building. You still want to make sure you're at least 5 feet from the fan, and time averaging of 10 seconds is probably adequate. You get above 10 miles an hour or so, and this varies a lot depending on exactly what the fluctuations look like. Now you should be doing both measures. You should be measuring your outdoor pressure on the leeward side, of course, away from the fan, and turn up your time averaging period. We've been giving that advice for many, many years on how to deal with the wind effect. Anything more you want to say about that, Bill?
Well, I think the only thing that's changed, these were the conclusions that you and Gary came up with last summer, just reinforcing here, but that picture now shows something that I think Gary's been thinking about. And Gary talks about this more in some recent webinars as well, which is he does like this T. He said, oh, the Europeans sure seem to be doing some testing and they like the T. And so he confirmed with his own data. And so this is now something we're adding to the Minneapolis blower door kits, where we'll include this T that you can use. Gary likes it because it does have the benefit of giving you some good readings from the T. And then where he's putting the tube is at the top of this larger PEX tubing, which also keeps it out of any water that might be getting into that. So that's kind of it's a very inexpensive way, and we're not changing the price at all. It's just something we can throw in there that will hopefully make it a little easier to get that reading.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to turn it back over to Bill to describe how we have implemented a change to TEC AutoTest called the Wind Assistant.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. And it kind of builds on what you were just talking about, which is, when it's windy, there's some best practices to follow. And what Wind Assistant is trying to do in this first phase of its release is help a new user recognize when should I be changing my periods of record and making some of those adjustments. Next column. And so I'm going to briefly explain it. And then, like I said, the meat of this webinar will be Colin taking you through the data. So if you're not familiar with AutoTest, I think if you're on this webinar, you probably are. But this is our app, iOS and Android-based app that helps you automate your testing, your data collection. And so this is just a quick shot of all the screens. It does have the ability to do single and multi-point tests to many different standards. And at the end of it, it has GPS location. And at the end, then you have the ability to take that data and share it as a PDF report, or store the data in a Google Drive or Dropbox or any type of cloud storage that you have. Next. So this is where we've embedded the Wind Assistant. And so when you download the new AutoTest that is coming out, you'll see that when you open it up and go into the settings, that there's now under the AutoTest settings for envelope, the Wind Assistant shows up. And what this is showing you is that you can, if you click on it, you have 3 modes you can put it in. Always off, which means that maybe you've tried it and you don't like it. You'd like, maybe you're a very advanced user and you don't need this to tell you when, so you can just turn it off. There's also a mode where it's always on. And this would be where some of the adjustments that it makes, maybe you're on a coastal setting where you always want it on and you don't want to be reminded. But it defaults, and most users will want to be in this suggest when to use mode. That means it will detect during the initial pre-baseline how much wind am I seeing and how much fluctuation in building pressure am I seeing during this 10-second baseline. And if I see too much variation, I'm going to tell you, looks like it's windy. Do you want to switch to Wind Assistant mode, where it will make some adjustments to your time average period or your period of record, how fast it adjusts the fan speed, and then the target tolerance that it puts on that building pressure. So there's some default settings, but for advanced users, they could say, I want to make some tweaks to those numbers as well. So it gives a lot of flexibility, but for a larger organization where you might have some new raters or new people doing these tests, it really helps you have everybody recognize when wind is happening and have the software make the adjustment for you. Next. So this is these are the results from a test I did up north on our cabin, and this was built in '92. And I told Colin as we were getting ready for this, I'm very excited to test this building. I grew up on this lake in the summers. My parents are teachers, and so they built a new cabin in the early '90s, and we always had to crack the door to get, when we were starting a fire, to make sure that we could get the stack effect to go up the chimney. And that's the sign of a pretty tight building. And so I was pretty excited to get it tested. And so I just ran this test, and I did it under calm conditions and then simulated windy conditions to say, can I get Wind Assistant to show on? I just took a fan out and blew it on the outdoor hose. And the one on the left is what happened in the calm conditions. And what you can see here is just like I hoped, it was a pretty tight building with a 2.1 or 2.2 ACH50. But on the left, under calm conditions, the time average period shows 10 seconds. On the right, under the windy conditions, I get about the same results, 2.1, but there you can see the time average period was moved to 30 seconds. And on the far right, this graphic under the AutoTest Wind Assistant, you can see that when I simulated the wind, this little icon for the Wind Assistant came up right during the test, so that I knew it said, hey, I'm detecting wind. I'm going to switch over. Is that okay? And I said, yes, please do. And that's why I got those 30-second periods of records instead of 10. So it extended my test a little bit, but I got very good results, as you can see. Next. So, in summary, the Wind Assistant turned on. I had it in the suggest when to use mode, and it did recognize that and asked me if I wanted to move over to those longer settings, which I accepted. It added about 20 seconds from 10 to 30 in this case, because I kept it at the default for my periods of records. And then it was a little slower to reach the 50 Pascal reading. Now, I only did a single point test, so it didn't add a lot of time to my test between the two. If you're doing a multi-point, you're going to have that added time to every one of your readings and the baselines. So it might add something on the order of 5 to 8 minutes. Okay, so that's just a quick summary of the test, but like we said, the meat of this webinar is to have Colin take us through some data and show us how does it really work over repeated tests. So Colin, you can go next and we'll move it back to you to look at some of the data.
Thanks a lot, Bill. So recently, Gary and I, after this feature had been implemented, we did a series of tests on our own houses, intentionally under windy weather, and running auto test in the suggest mode to see what the effect would be on an actual user in windy or calm weather. And our goals were to confirm, first of all, just the basics, that this feature is doing what Bill said it does, that it only turns on if windy conditions are detected, and it improves the data uncertainty when there is significant wind. So it does that mostly by increasing the sampling period. And we just wanted to make sure that for a typical user using this on an arbitrary day, that it doesn't tend to deliver worse data than with it wind assistant off.
Yeah, I want to say back, because you said something when we were first looking at this that I thought was really important. We said, oh, we got to test this in windy conditions. And you made the point. I just want to reinforce it. No, we want to test this under all conditions to make sure it doesn't turn on when you don't need it. I think that's a really important point, and I'm excited that that's what your data is going to talk about.
Yeah, that's a really good point. This needs to be a helpful feature. We've basically distilled the recommendations that our main tech support person, Paul Moran, has been giving people for years of what to do when it's windy. And now we want that to happen only when it's windy. And,
right.
and that's what we're trying to confirm. So here's a screenshot of all of the tests that I did on my house. I did a series of 81 tests, and I'm going to talk about the data that I took because I'm most familiar with that.
Okay.
And I'm going to switch over to TechBlog here and show you what that looks like. In addition to recording with AutoTest, I was recording in parallel with this program TechLog. And with TechLog, we can look in great detail at every single test. I could zoom in here on an arbitrary test, and we could look at the series of house pressures, or we can turn on the fan pressures and we can look at those as well. So I will be referring to this as we go along.
Colin, I am sorry to interrupt, but just in case some people aren't familiar with TechBlog, this is a program that you wrote some years ago, but this is designed for doing multi fan testing, bigger, larger buildings. But this is available for free from our website, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it's a really powerful tool for doing multi-fan tests, but it's also a logging software. It's a really powerful software tool for when you're trying to understand, what you're doing here. But if we have users out there that aren't familiar with it, they really should go find it, because it's pretty intuitive and it gives you a lot of information when you want to log test results.
Yeah, I agree. And you can perform an automated or a multi-point test with this program. And if you're doing work on larger buildings or maybe a high profile building, it has a lot of features that are useful, like using multiple outdoor pressure taps and just the ability to see in high resolution what's going on. So let me show kind of what was going on this particular day. If I turn on only the house pressures, you can see that there's a clump of data up here near zero. These are the pressures in pascals during the period when the blower door is off. And these lines going down vertically are, of course, when we're depressurizing. And so we have targets between 25 and 60 pascals. But what you can see in general terms, if I zoom in on these house pressures and I get rid of the line, you can see that we started out with some amount of noise, plus or minus a Pascal to 4 or 5, depending on which test you choose here. But it was getting progressively worse throughout the day.
Yeah.
And that's corroborated by the weather data on this day, which you could look up for Madison, Wisconsin, if you want, and see that it was getting progressively windier and windier throughout the day, starting out at about 10 miles an hour and going up to 15 and gusting up over 20 miles an hour.
The x-axis is actually the time of that day. Is that right, Colin?
Yeah, that's right. Central time.
Yeah.
So you can see I started at about 9:30 and was finishing up about 5:30.
Okay.
And so that tells the story of how the conditions were degrading throughout the day.
Yeah.
And so here's the graph of what happened. This is data directly out of AutoTest. What I'm showing here is the CFM50 result from the multi-point test. And so it's not a particularly tight house, ranging between 1500 and 1650. And this is just the test number. So 81 tests throughout the day. And this is more or less a graph of time as well, because they're in the order that the tests were taken.
Okay.
And what you see here is this really isn't a bad result. The fluctuations that you're seeing from test to test for CFM50, this would be actionable data for decision making on a typical house. But the blue dots are the times when the wind assistant settings did not kick in, and the red dots are the times when wind assistant settings did kick in.
Yeah.
So when you take a minute to think about that, and you look at the prevalence of the wind assistant kicking in, it's much higher in the afternoon as the conditions were degrading. But you can see that the data quality did not degrade throughout the day. It's staying relatively constant.
So as it got windier, it didn't mean you got worse results, because essentially wind assistant was doing its job. They took longer, but you still got good data.
That's right. There are notable exceptions, and we'll talk about this little test down here. This is not perfect, but generally speaking, it really is doing its job. It's, especially for a novice user, it's kicking into these wind assistant settings when it should. One thing I would note is if this were a completely calm period, all these blue dots would be pretty close to one another and there would be no red dots. Because we've confirmed separately that the wind assistant does not kick in when the winds are stable. Yep. Another thing that people care about, other than the CFM50, is the correlation coefficient. And the reason they care about that is that it's a requirement for some of the standards and for some programs that you might be operating under. Typically, you need the correlation coefficient to be 0.99 or higher. Or if you do what's called R squared, which is just this number squared, then that would have to be 0.98 or higher. But for the correlation coefficient, anything above this line would meet that requirement. Anything below the line would not. So what you see is that even earlier in the day, we were getting a couple that would have been not valid tests. Yeah. And you would have probably needed to repeat that test. But in the afternoon, you see that quite often it was kicking into these wind assistant settings, and there was no need to repeat a test. And repeating a test could be pretty disruptive. I think it's a lot more acceptable to just get the result the first time, even if it takes a little bit longer. And to see what that looks like in terms of the actual data quality, here we have the graphs from a couple of these tests. Here's a correlation coefficient of over 0.99, and you can see that the data points are pretty close to the best fit line.
I think that's your first test. If you look, it's like at 9:37 a.m., right? So it's like one of your early tests during a calmer period.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then what we should maybe have shown is one of these tests, but we're not showing that. But what we're showing is really the exception to the rule here. That occasionally the wind assistant will make the wrong decision and it will not use the wind assistant settings even in a case where it should have. So here's an example of that. Let me just flip over to TechLog here and try to show what happened. So if I'm going to turn on my fan pressures here, I'm going to turn on my lines, and I'm going to zoom in on this test. And you can see what happened is, here's when the pre-test baseline was taken. And that's the data we use to determine if we need to kick into the wind assistant settings or not. And you can see we kind of got unfortunate because the wind was fluctuating a fair amount, but AutoTest just happened to be taking its data right here during this flat period where we're not getting much variation. If you say show stats, then you can pull up the standard deviation of half a Pascal on the house pressure. It's just really luck of the draw.
That's a 10-second box, right? That's the 10-second baseline.
That's right.
Standard baseline. Okay.
Yeah, and then later on, the wind, true to form, it just happened to kick up during some of the lower pressure points. And look at the unusual gusts here. This is supposed to be a progression from the high targets down to the lower targets, but it just has a mind of its own here, and that's just the wind kicking up.
Yeah.
So this is something that can happen. So you will still have the need to repeat a test on occasion, but it's relatively rare that happened in this series of 80 tests.
So what you just pointed out, I fell into the trap. I said the one on top was the first test when it was calmer, which is true, but the real thing was the wind was steadier because it was calmer, right?
Yes, good point.
Okay, and so if I got the results that you just took us through, that blue dot with a low correlation coefficient, and I needed to retest, it might be that this next time around during the baseline, wind assistant would kick in. It would say, hey, looks kind of windy. I mean, based on the red dots around that test. Is that true?
Yes, and you might want to just, when you already know that it's a windy day, you might just want to switch it over to the wind assistant on setting.
Yeah.
Rather than to use the suggest mode. Typically, suggest mode is going to give you the right answer across a variety of test conditions, so you can kind of set it and forget it. But if you're in that situation where it got windy mid-test, you may want to just turn it on for the next test.
Yep, that makes sense.
And here's I talked earlier about the measuring down at 4 pascals or 10 pascals. Effective leakage area is at 4 pascals. So you can see you're getting higher percent fluctuations here than what I showed you in the CFM50. But again, the variation throughout the day as the conditions were worsening didn't really pick up significantly.
Yeah.
So it's especially important to use the longer time averaging periods when you're outputting an ELA from your test. And this is work that we've been involved in for quite a while. I'd recommend you look up this paper on testing on 11-story building during 2 different periods of time over both summer and winter. Here we were averaging the 4 sides of the building, and we were exploring the effects of doing a single point test at 50 or 75 pascals compared to a multi-point test that took the same amount of time. The upshot of this was that doing repeated single point tests at your highest target is the most efficient way to get good data on a windy day.
Yeah. That makes sense after what you just showed us with how much uncertainty at lower pressures, the same amount of building pressure affects the accuracy of that reading. Your CFM20 or your CFM10 is going to be different than your CFM50.
Yep.
In terms of uncertainty. Makes some sense.
So we're not the only ones working on studying the effects of wind and the baseline changing. Especially the Europeans are very active on this subject. I can't begin to go through all the research that's being done there, and I'd be afraid of leaving people out, which I've done on this slide. But I would just say there's a whole lot of work ongoing. We're in communication with these researchers and excited to see what we can come up with.
Yeah, that's great,
I'll
Colin.
hand it
Thank
back
you.
to you, Bill.
Yeah. So I'm going to step through pretty quickly, kind of the marketing finish here. So where do you get more information? Next, Colin. So what you just saw, just as a reminder, is the Wind Assistant, and that's a part of the TEC AutoTest. And so you can get that if you don't have that app. You can download it from our website under software. And when you click on it, it goes directly into a download that you can get. We've cleaned this process up. It's much more streamlined than it used to be in the past, where you'd have to create an account and things like that. So it's pretty straightforward. Next. And then, this video, this webinar will be put up on YouTube, and you can find a lot of other videos, including the one that Colin referenced with Gary looking at wind effect on our YouTube channel, Energy Conservatory. And then on our website, you can also find the links to these videos if you go to the training menu. Also on our website, you can sign up for our newsletter. And if you're not signed up for it, I do encourage you to do that. It's a great way to keep track of what we're up to. Next. And so these newsletters come out about once a month. And, it really gives you a view of what are all the things that TEC is working on. And I'm going to give you like the 10-second version of our top few things. Next. The first one is we have a new digital TrueFlow coming out, and that's actually going to start shipping this month, May of 2021. This is a major update to the TrueFlow, the legacy TrueFlow, and it's a Bluetooth device that connects to a dedicated app, along with our DG8 manometer, which also Bluetooth connects to that app, and really streamlines the whole process of measuring HVAC airflow, total system airflow. Last month, you may have seen Gary Nelson has a new product that he's been tinkering with that's now available as a kit from us. You can find it on our store, and we're calling it the Gary Nelson Fog Puffer, for lack of a better name. And it's pretty fun. It's pretty cool. It's based on a turkey baster and vape pen technology, and he's really come up with a really cool way of implementing a check valve. It delivers a really nice stream of proper density fog, essentially vapor, that really works well for finding leaks in residential buildings. People like weatherization and things like that when you're looking for leaks. Next. The last two I'm going to mention very quickly is the DG8 is out. This is a single channel manometer, very cost effective, lists for $549, but gives you blower door style accuracy. And so very good as you're looking at building pressures and looking maybe at room pressures and zonal pressures and things like that. Maybe looking at combustion appliance zones to make sure that they don't depressurize. And then the DG1000 also has some new updates out, where that software was just released for the onboard software. An update to the tubing assistant. Now it helps you set up for duct leakage to outside. There's standalone logging, where you can set up the DG1000 to log on its own without any peripheral devices like a computer. And then there's a pitot velocity mode where it can measure that. Next. So those are all the updates. A lot going on at TEC right now. We really thank you for joining. And now we're going to open it up. You maybe have some questions for Colin on the Wind Assistant.